the politics and the history of oil, what I want to survey with you today, some basic questions about oil in the Middle East, its history, its strategic significance, its social and political implications. Questions about who has the oil, what are the circumstances in which it was discovered and drilled, and the social implications of where the oil is with regards to both the geography but also the history of the Middle East in terms of what we've been covering in the class so far. So I will start first by a section on the strategic importance of oil in the Middle East pertaining to war and the First and the Second World Wars, and then say something about, to take us deeply into where the oil is in the Middle East and who has it and what the implications of its geographic distribution are. I'll start with something completely unrelated to, apparently unrelated to the Middle East. Let's see, where is the cursor? And it is, it's a military plan. It's a military plan that's an old German military plan that was devised by somebody called Schlieffen, a famous military general, and it was German. And it was a plan that was devised way towards the end of the 19th century after the Franco-German War of 1870-1871. And it's basically a, I'm not going to go through the details of it, but it's a plan of how to annihilate and crush the French army in the prospect of any future war between these two countries. And as you can see, the plan was not of a straight frontal attack by the Germans on the French, but a huge encircling movement on, interestingly, not the capital, not Paris, but on the main concentration of the French army. Basically to encircle it from the west as well as from the east, to have a huge pincer movement on it. I'm not going to go through it. It's a famous plan. It's a famous military plan. Those who study military strategy study this. It's a plan that has been inspired by a much, much older plan in ancient history, in Roman history, the plan by which Hannibal defeated his enemies in the 2nd century AD. So it's a very old, and it was a similar encircling plan, but of course a much smaller scale. I'm not interested in all of these things. We can talk about it, but the main thing is that Paris would have been engulfed, literally, by this movement. This is a plan that was devised and elaborated on in 1905, 1906. It became a cardinal dominating plan in military, in the high brass of the German military. This is how they anticipated defeated France in any future war. And people by 1905, 1906, definitely by 1911, 1912, realized that a big war is about to happen in Europe, and most likely it will pitch the Germans against the French. Now, the interesting thing is that when the war actually broke out in 1914, and this plan was put in motion, when the troops, the German troops, were very close to occupying Paris, most of the French reserves were down in the south. The main French army is by the borders, and there are very few troops that remained to save and protect Paris. And most of the communication lines have been designed, and the railway lines have been designed to ferry the troops to the front. And now that the army, the German army, is encircling Paris from the north, the people in charge of the defenses of Paris were at a loss. Simon, you have a question?
No.
No, okay. But as we know, Paris was not invaded in the First World War. Paris was invaded in the Second World War by the Germans. But in the First World War, Paris was saved. And it was saved because of taxis. The person in charge of the defense of Paris rallied all the taxi cabs of Paris and organized them in such a way as to ferry the troops one caravan after the other to the front. No railways, no main roads, it was the taxi cabs, and this person is called Gallieni, and if you go to Paris, he has a main street named after him in honor of basically saving Paris because of his organizational skills. Now, why am I mentioning this in a lecture about oil? Because this would not have been possible except with oil. The First World War is famous for the history of oil because it is the first war in human history in which it was actually a mechanized war. This is mechanized warfare on the sea, in the air, and on the ground. And there are various examples to highlight the significance of oil and the different mechanized warfare that characterized this First World War. And one of them is this famous story. I think realistically Paris was saved through other means, but it's very popular when speaking about how Paris was saved in the First World War to say, and because even back then, he himself said, this is something funky here happening. Yes, Yusuf.
I don't understand how it's saved.
Without the automobile, without the internal combustion engine, the war would have looked very differently. With the invention of the automobile, 15, 20 years earlier, and with now oil in a sense, as they say, oil went to war in the First World War. The First World War could not be written about, could not be understood, except if you factor in oil. This is not now cavalry charging on horseback. It is tanks and cars. Now, tanks were introduced a bit later. I think in 1916 the first tank was introduced. But tanks, again, could not be conceived of without oil. As far as airplanes, the interesting thing about airplanes is, which of course were introduced in the First World War, was initially for reconnaissance, to take pictures and to know where the troops were, the enemy troops were. But eventually an interesting discovery, an invention was made, which is about the machine guns. Initially, the machine guns were not put on both wings, were put in front of the pilot so that he can see what it is that he's shooting at. But the problem is with the propellers, without coordinating the speed with which and the frequency with which the bullets came out of the gun and the rotation of the propeller, he could in fact shoot himself down. He could shoot the propeller. So it was a very simple mechanical timing mechanism that made sure that the machine gun would fire at a speed that is in coordination with the speed of the rotation of the propeller. I mean, these are technical things. You can see that I had a previous history as a military buff. Yes.
I read somewhere about that issue because they solved, one of the pilots solved it by attaching the gun in front of the propeller. So you have the gun and the propeller behind it.
Yes.
That caused the problem because the bullets fly away.
Yes.
And the propeller kept hitting the pieces of the bullets, hitting other planes beside him.
Yes, because exactly, because it is, if you put the machine gun in front of the propeller, you can suck them in. You can suck the bullets in. That is what the propeller does.
I think he was fired. Or killed himself.
Or killed himself in front of the. So, in any case, the main point again, without oil, you could not think about war in the air. In the first place. So the First World War is famous for the history of oil because of this, because in the air and on the ground, but most importantly in the sea. That is the most decisive thing as far as the Middle East is concerned. Why? For the following reason. Again, as I've been saying, from 1911, all military experts, all strategic experts in London, in Berlin, in Paris were preparing for an imminent war. They knew that this would be a decisive war, and we talked about it way earlier in the semester. Now, the main thing is that Churchill, when he was still First Lord of the Admiralty, took a very famous, fateful decision, as it is called, the fateful plunge, which is to transform the ships of the entire British fleet from relying on coal to relying on oil. The idea being that if you transform these ships, you can save cargo space, you can, it is cleaner, more, and most importantly, it is more efficient. In other words, the internal combustion engine of these ships, of the warships, will gain a very important and decisive 4 knots per hour of speed on the high seas. And that was deemed to be decisive. Speed is of the essence. In any naval confrontation on the high seas, speed is of the essence. And that was the strategic thought, that it is actually worthwhile transforming the entire British fleet from relying on coal to relying on oil, because they knew that a war is happening. The war they thought would be decided on the high seas, and the war is going to take place against Germany, and Germany is investing very, very heavily in building a formidable fleet. And the British Empire, as we know, became an empire because it controlled the seas, because it has the mighty navy. And the question is how to transform the warships, not the merchant fleets, but the warships, from relying on coal to relying on oil. Aslan.
Back then, the British, before the oil, the British were the biggest exporters of coal.
Yes.
And the Churchill's move to switch everything from coal to oil, wasn't that like, these are my 2 legs, I'll shoot myself on this one?
Yes.
This was their own economy.
Exactly. It's not a matter of exporting as much as producing. The British Isles are very rich in coal, but they have no oil.
So isn't that when Gertrude decided to do the whole Iraq situation?
That is precisely the point. That this decision, the reason I'm mentioning it in connection to this class, is that this decision would not have been made had the British not already established themselves in the Middle East and been aware of the presence of huge oil reserves, especially in Persia. This is where oil had first been discovered, in Persia, in Iran, and way before the Americans entered the scene. It was British companies and British prospectors and British investors who paved the way for this link to be established between London and the British economy and the British war machine and Middle Eastern oil reserves. Again, the story is a flamboyant story. It's with amazing characters and amazing, I mean, till today, the enormous amounts of money we're talking about. But I want to concentrate on only one aspect of this. There are many intrigues and spy stories and love stories, and of course a huge amount of treachery and bloodshed and oppression that goes with oil in the Middle East. But I want to concentrate on only one aspect that I think is very important, which is the following. That the way in which these companies, Western companies, first the British and the French and the Dutch, later the Americans, they come in and they look for oil in not England or France or the United States. They've been doing this there as well. But now that oil has been discovered in commercial quantities, especially in Persia, in southwest Iran. That's when oil was first discovered in commercial quantities. The question is, how do we get a share of it? Now, I want to explain something here. What do we mean by commercial quantities?
Where the cost that you'll sell it at exceeds all operational costs and any costs mining it.
Exactly.
In order to get it.
Commercial quantities is that when you discover oil in such large quantities as would make it worth your while to put so much money in prospecting and drilling and refining it, because you know that there's so much of it that when you sell it in the market, you will be able to cover your costs. That is what commercial quantities are. And oil was discovered in commercial quantities in 1901 in Iran. The question is, this oil is discovered way out there in another country called Iran, later on in Iraq, later on in what came to be known as Saudi Arabia. The question is, how would the British have access to it? It's through people like this guy, in collaboration with people like this guy. So you have these businessmen and financiers and adventurers looking to make easy money, and these despots. They could not be described except as despots. These rulers, most of them are actually tribal rulers. Of course, Iran, he's a Shah, he's a king, he's like the Sultan. And basically, they make, the deal is what is called a concession. It's a special kind of a contract, if you will, whereby this guy and the Sauds and the Sabbahs and the Khalifas later on of the Arab world would come to the companies, the Western companies and the Western businessmen, and tell them, look, we don't know where the oil is. We don't know whether you'll find it or not. We don't have the equipment. We don't have the infrastructure. You do. You have the money. You have the expertise. You have the know-how. I'll give you this concession. In other words, we'll take a piece of map and we'll draw on the map a huge area. It's a big gamble. We don't know whether you'll find oil in this area or not. This is a concession. We, that is I, the Sultan, I, the Shah, I, the King, give you a concession. You take the gamble. You invest, you hire, you build. And if you find oil, we'll share it. If you don't find oil, it's your loss. But if you find it, we'll share it. And the question is what the percentage is. Usually it was 50-50, although I really don't know the percentages. But a huge chunk of the profit would go to these companies. The main thing is that the local powers, that is the local, these guys, the money goes to them. It goes to the coffers of the Sauds. It goes to the coffers, to the pockets of the Sabbahs, the Khalifas. So it's a very interesting arrangement, a huge amount of investment put by Western companies, and and they get a huge chunk of the profit if and when they find the oil. And the money that goes to the local country, it actually goes to the ruler of the country. Because with the exception, because even in Iran, but even more so in Iraq, which we've been talking about, and definitely way later in Saudi Arabia, and then way later in the 60s and 70s in the Gulf countries of Qatar and Kuwait and the Emirates, as we'll explain in a minute, there are no government structures. There are no sophisticated government structures to talk about. Most of the deals are struck between between two men, basically. So it's something I'll develop in a minute. It's the peculiar nature of these concessions that explain a lot of how the oil has been spent, how the oil was discovered, where the oil went, where the oil money went. It's people like these who actually have the say. Just to elaborate, it's only until very recently did Saudi Arabia make a distinction between the private purse of the king and the national budget. So this is what I'm talking about. The money goes to the ruling family. The money goes to some individuals, and then these individuals have a say in how the oil money is to be spent. Just very quickly, I mean, I'm not going to talk much about it, but again, if you can actually also write a big, not the whole, but a big chunk of the history of the Second World War as revolving around oil. And most of the accounts, you know, it took maybe many years in military history to realize and to write kind of a strategic economic history of the Second World War. And according to that history, it's not the generals, of course, Hitler and Stalin and Churchill matter, and the military side of, obviously, the war matters. But the decisive factor that that decided the outcome of the war was economic. I'm referring to an amazing book that I've been reading. I mean, not only a book, but you know, it's a huge body of literature. Richard Evans, one of the most interesting historians of Nazi Germany, and I've been reading this last summer, the last of his trilogy, you know, 700 pages long, each volume, 3 volumes, and the last volume is the Third Reich in War. And he decides on the war, the author, decides on the war and the outcome of the war in the first 2 chapters of these 700 pages, and basically says, without oil, the Third Reich, that is Germany, had no chance. Once the United States entered the war, there was no way that Germany could defeat both the Soviet Union and the United States at the same time without access to oil. And he had interesting predictions of how soon the German war machine would have dried out without access, especially to Middle Eastern oil supplies. Hence the significance of 1942. 2 turning points in the history of the war, 2 important battles. I don't know whether any of you know. Stalingrad in 1942 and no, that's later. No, but Normandy is, you know, a fait accompli once it happened. But the other turning point also in 1942. El Alamein here. Stalingrad here and El Alamein here. Both of them have the rationale is the attempt by the German troops to have access to the oil fields in Baku, in the northern Caspian, and in the Gulf. So the Middle Eastern oil fields here were as significant as the oil fields in South Asia, in the Ukraine, as far as the outcome of the war was concerned. And once they lost Alamein and Stalingrad, it was basically a done deal. It was a matter of time, and of course millions of people, but it was basically it. So again, the Middle Eastern oil supplies were enormously important for the lubricating of the entire war machine of the Allies, and more importantly, of denying the Germans access to this very important. Had they had access to this, and of course the Suez Canal and Egypt, and it would have been very different.
Isn't Stalingrad oftentimes though seen as like a very pointless battle?
Yeah.
Because of that?
Well, Stalingrad, I mean, the difference between Stalingrad and Alamein could not be sharper. Alamein is these open expanse, huge amounts of desert, huge amounts of distances covered in a few hours. And Stalingrad, those of you who've seen the movie Enemy at the Gates, what's his name? Jude Law. That's the and it's a siege that went on for I don't know what, 6-7 months? No, more, a year, pointless. But and it was the determination of the Soviets and Stalin. I mean, it was a huge prestige. The city is named after him. He would not really allow it to fall. But
same thing with Hitler, right? He didn't like he was insistent on capturing Stalingrad.
Yeah, and diverted his troops between the north, the center, and the south. But again, the drive to the south was mostly to capture the Baku oil fields in the Ukraines, and to be able to have some breathing space as far as oil supplies are concerned. So, I mean, I don't really need to explain, I don't think, the significance of oil. It is the engine of the war. It is the engine of the world economy. It's a very important, vital natural resource, and a huge amount of it is located in the part of the world we're studying. So this is just some background on the connection between oil and war, and we can talk about many other wars in the region itself. But the First and the Second World Wars could also be written in such a way as one important chapter of each of them would be about Middle Eastern oil supplies. Let us delve in a bit and see where this oil is specifically, and try and identify the significance of the Middle Eastern oil supplies, oil consumption, and oil reserves. Remember these three things. We have the production, we have the reserves, and we have the consumption. Three aspects that are important, especially in how they intermesh with each other, in order to explain the significance of the Middle Eastern oil supplies. But if you just look at a geological map, so to speak, it's a huge, I mean, the area is floating over a sea of oil and natural gas. The red is natural gas, the green is oil fields. These are the discovered oil wells, and this is how they are mapped, and the size of them. And it's a hugely rich part, and of course there are other areas in the larger Middle East and the Arab world, but just to concentrate on the Persian Gulf area, this is how it looks like. Now let us translate it in terms of weighing the amount of oil each country has, and if we play visually a bit, this is how the world would look like if we are to weigh the size of the country with the amount of oil it has. You see how tiny the United States is, how tiny the entire continent of Europe is, and how huge Saudi Arabia is. This is a very significant player in the world's economy because of the enormous amounts of oil it has. But it's not only the production of oil that matters. I want to, but before elaborating further, I want to share with you some further graphs so that you understand the significance of, again, where the oil is in the Middle East in respect to the larger world, and also within the Middle East itself. So some further graphs. This is the production by year, and you can see the how it keeps on increasing, especially in the Middle East. It's a very important part of the world as far as oil production is concerned. The United States is a very important producer, but there's something about the United States that makes it less significant in terms of the oil, the international oil market. Within the Middle East, again, Saudi Arabia is a huge giant compared to Iraq and the other countries. And again, just to see, this is measured, this is a bit old, 2,000 billions of barrels. B is barrels of oil per day. Now, that is the significant thing. So it's not only the amount of oil that a country produces, but the amount of oil, the amount of reserves it has, or proven reserves. Now, who can suggest a definition of the reserves? Simon?
It's just like oil that's not used there, but it's sitting underneath the ground that can be used and can be get.
Yes.
Very rapidly.
And isn't it also the potential of the production of oil underground?
Precisely. Precisely. It is the amount of oil that has been discovered. There may be more. But proven reserves is the amount of oil that has been proven to exist, and that you can actually drill and produce. So again, in this respect, the Saudi Arabia is a huge actor, because not only of the oil it produces, but of the amount of oil it can still produce. The amount of oil that it is not producing, but it's banking, it's underground. It doesn't really need to look for. It has already been proven. The amount of the oils and the size of the wells and their depth is such that they can count on producing these billions of barrels a day and that's the key thing, for years to come. Now, it is actually by combining these three aspects together, the amount of oil you produce, and the amount of oil you have, and the amount of oil you consume. So if you look at the United States does not, the reason why the United States is so vulnerable to Middle Eastern oil is for the following reasons. First of all, it has only 2% of the proven world reserves of oil. Whereas the Middle East, OPEC countries, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, I'll talk about in a minute, has 68% of the proven reserves, and the rest of the world has 30%. So the United States cannot guarantee that its own oil reserves are large enough to sustain, especially the enormous consumption. So United States consumes 25% of alone, this one country alone, consumes 1/4 of the entire consumption of the world of oil. OPEC consumes only 8%, the rest of the world consumes 66%. And in terms of productions, you can see. So the OPEC countries are very important because they have an enormous amount of banked reserves under the ground. It produces 41% of the total world's production of oil, and it only consumes 8% of it. So there's so much available to export. This is why they're called OPEC exporting countries.
I was wondering, how easy is it to fudge like the number of like your reserve percentage?
How easy is it?
Like to fudge it, or to like what is it? To like shift the numbers, or like.
But why would you shift it?
Like to guess. Oh, so you would say you have more reserves than you actually do.
No, it's you know. I mean, these are things that the companies I'm not an expert, but I wouldn't. I don't think it's something that is easy to fudge. But you have a reason to ask the question. I think I understand the question, but what do you mean by it?
Oh, I was just because I felt that like if you had the ability to say you have more reserves than you actually do, then that would increase like foreign investment and oil companies going into your country. So you would have an increased short term.
Probably. It's a good question, and I don't know. I would think that there is a way of double checking your claims.
Because especially in non-transparent governments.
Yeah, but again, the countries are not the reason I mentioned these kings and sultans and so on is to highlight that the countries are not the only players. The companies are part of the picture. It's foreign Western companies that come and drill and make these assessments. So there's an international expertise. It's not a sovereign decision by the King of Saudi Arabia who can fudge the numbers without anyone checking on him. Here first and then here.
How come the OPEC countries or the Middle East got huge shares? I don't get.
Because they're not industrialized, mostly. Because this is an industrial country, and it's a huge economy. And if the same applies to Japan. Japan, even the contrast is even sharper in Japan because Japan doesn't have oil. So the Japan, you know, it's interesting. Europe, the United States, and Japan, but United States less because the United States has very significant oil reserves itself. But as far as Europe is concerned, especially before the discovery of oil in the North Sea by Britain, the world economy, the industrialized world economy, depends very, very heavily on Middle Eastern, especially oil reserves. Aslan.
I don't know if this is important, but the numbers don't add up.
Why I wasn't just confused.
Why they don't add up? I did add them up.
No, consumption is 68, but production 51% and 41%, that's 92%.
No.
That's 10%, that's 100.
No, you add this, and that.
Yes.
So 2 and 68 is 70.
Yes.
Plus
It's
30.
100.
It's 100.
Now, look at the production.
Production, this one, 10, and 41, and 51.
It's 102%.
Yes.
Our consumption is
That's true.
96%.
Yeah, this is less. Yeah, the 51, 41 is, yeah, there is something above.
Maybe someone did forge that.
Yeah, you're right. There is some discrepancy. I frankly cannot remember. I didn't do this map myself, this chart. Some of the other charts I did, but this one I should have given you where I got it from. But you're right. 66, 88. Yeah, they don't add up to 100. But they give an indication, a vague indication of where things are. I think the main thing about reserves is if you measure it by years. And that's the key thing. That's the key political thing, is the amount of years it would take for any country to run out of oil, given the amount of oil that has been discovered and the rate with which it produces it and ultimately consumes it. So in this case, Saudi Arabia will run out of oil after 8 years at the rate with which it produces. and Kuwait. And this is why Iraq is important, because the oil reserves in Iraq are huge, and Iraq is not producing enough, but it can. If there are enough investments in refineries and transportation, and Iraq can be a very important player. Again, if you want to think about the significance of the Iraq war, if you want to think about the significance of oil and the amount of investments that American companies have made following the end of the war in order to tap in this enormous oil wealth. So it's again, it's measured in years. So that's another, so it's not the rate of producing, it's not the rate of consumption, it's not the amount of reserves, it's all of this together. It's the amount of reserves that have been already proven, and the rate with which you consume it and export it, and you just make an assessment of how much time will it take for this oil to run out. Of course, this doesn't take into account the possibility of discovering more oil. So these are the proven reserves. There may be more. But even without further drilling, without further prospecting for oil, this is how many years Saudi Arabia will take to run out of oil, given the rate with which it consumes or exports oil. What also, last thing I'll say about this aspect, what makes Saudi Arabia a huge player is that the investments are already there. Saudi Arabia doesn't really need to do anything but give an order to increase or decrease, because it can increase in no time. Just open the tap more. Because the refineries are there, the pipelines are there, the wells are there, the expertise is already in place. It's just a sovereign decision on how much to export oil and change the prices. So that is the enormous amount of control Saudi Arabia has in the international oil market. Just something very briefly to again contrast how did this, all of this oil, how did it manifest itself in daily life in the region? Let's start with the countries like Saudi Arabia, like Kuwait, in which oil has been discovered in huge quantities. Just some contrasting images with no comment. So it's a huge impact. Oil was discovered, interestingly, when you think about it. Zoom out, you know the region, you know its history. Oil was not discovered in Damascus, in Istanbul, in Egypt. Oil was not discovered in, with the exception of Iraq, in areas of high population density, in areas of settled agricultural, historically, communities. Oil was discovered on the fringes of the historical Middle East. If you think about the region we've been discussing in this course, the center of gravity is in these cities I just mentioned. Damascus, Cairo, Istanbul. This is where things were happening. But oil was discovered in these fringes. This is a picture of Riyadh in the 20th century. Of course, this is how, I mean, this is ancient even. This is an old picture. Riyadh has been completely transformed since this picture has been taken. So it had a huge impact on lifestyle and internal power dynamics within the Middle East and in each one of these countries. Saudi Arabia can be self-sufficient in food. The population now of 20 million, No rainfall, no major desert, rivers, but Saudi Arabia has the economic and financial power that can actually transform the desert and into agricultural land, because it can invest, it can afford to build these desalination plants, which are hugely expensive, to transform seawater into potable water suitable for irrigation. This is a huge amount of money, but it's a strategic concern. It is infinitely more expensive to do this than export wheat from, let's say, Canada or the United States or Australia. But for strategic purposes, Saudi Arabia is investing hugely, why? Because it has all this, or it can have this potential financial power. Again, this is a bit old. Saudi Arabia is not investing as heavily as it used to in these desalination projects. I can multiply the examples. I'm sure you're familiar. I could have shown you multiple images of shopping malls in Saudi Arabia or in Dubai, or So I don't need to do this for you. And instead, I want to take you a bit to put the emphasis slightly differently, to try and see what the impact of oil is on the region as a whole, not only within, let's say, Saudi Arabia or Kuwait or the Emirates. And if I do this, what would be the main important aspect to look at? If I were to understand and to study the impact of oil on the region at large, the Middle East region at large, what is it that I would be looking at?
The GDP of each country?
Sorry?
The GDP of each country?
The GDP of?
Each country in the region?
Yes, yeah, but how would oil impact this?
The Gulf countries have a much higher GDP per capita than other countries in the region who does not have oil, which results in imbalance or inequality.
Of course, inequality and tension and wars and migration. You cannot write the history of the modern Middle East in the past, let's say, 50 years without factoring in inter-regional migration because of oil. Just a couple of graphs. I mean, you can read this. I mean, I'm going to upload this later today, but just to give you, I mean, these are absolute figures, not percentages. The number of foreigners, the nationals and the non-nationals in the labor force. This is in 2010. Saudi Arabia has 4 million foreigners in the labor force as opposed to 3.7 million Saudis. This is, of course, what prompted the Saudi government to embark on the Saudiization, the Sawada, of the labor force, to try and give incentives for companies to hire Saudis rather than to hire foreigners. In a country like Kuwait, there's 1.7 million non-nationals in the labor force as opposed to only 300,000 Kuwaitis in the labor force. And I think the most dramatic is the United Arab Emirates. 2.6 million foreigners as opposed to less than 1/10 that amount. So for every Emirati working in whichever job, you have 10 foreigners working in the country. Of course, they work in all kinds of jobs, and there is a history of migration. It depends if you take, for example, Egyptian migrants to Saudi Arabia, or Egyptian migrants to Libya, or Egyptian migrants to Kuwait. In the 50s, slightly different from the 70s, slightly different from the 90s. The first wave of Egyptian migrants to these countries were blue-collar workers, teachers, engineers, pharmacists, doctors. Later on, it's manual workers, sorry, I said blue workers, no, white-collar workers initially, the professionals. If you think about the thing that I study closely, the legal system, the legal systems of not Saudi Arabia, but of the Emirates, of Iraq, of many Arab countries, and Libya, is very much shaped by Egyptian lawyers and Egyptian judges who went and literally wrote sometimes the constitutions and the laws of these countries and ran the courts of them. All the stories about the judges floating around in Egypt now who had had an earlier life as the legal advisor to the Sultan of Qaboos, or there's a huge amount of Egyptian judges and legal experts who have made their careers in the Gulf and elsewhere in the Arab world.
The Kuwaiti constitution is mostly written by Egyptian judges, and still today there's still Egyptian judges who serve.
Yeah. And Libya, and to lesser degree Iraq, Jordan, and Syria. But again, if you think about the contribution of Palestinian teachers to the national economy of the Emirates, of Kuwait, of Iraq, Jordanians, Yemenis in Saudi Arabia. So it's a huge influx of expertise and manpower. These are the percentages. The percentages of foreigners in the workforce. So Saudi Arabia in 1975 had 25% expats. In 2000, nearly twice as much, 55%. The economy is expanding because of oil, but the population is not expanding fast enough. So what do? You import workers. You import workers from the region, Yemen, Egypt, Palestinians, Jordanians, but you also, especially with Saudi Arabia, you also import workers from South Asia, from Bangladesh, from the Philippines, from India, from Pakistan. There's a huge. This is a huge chapter in the history of the modern Middle East. Of course, this affects the economies and societies in huge and in very significant ways. Just to take one aspect of them is the remittances, that is the amount of earnings the Egyptian or Yemeni or Jordanian workers send back home, and how you can measure this. So this is 5% of the Egyptian GDP comes from remittances of workers living abroad, especially obviously in the Gulf region, more so than in the United States, Europe, or Australia. For Lebanon, it's 22%, but Lebanese is a bit different because many Lebanese actually are scattered throughout the world, not only in the Gulf region. But think about Jordan, the percentages. These are the absolute figures, but these are the percentages of the GDP that come from remittances. Morocco, 9.5% of the GDP of Morocco comes from remittances. But again, Morocco is slightly different because many of the workers do not work in the Gulf, but work in France or Spain. But it's cases like Egypt, Jordan, Yemen, of course, and Syria, and the Palestinians, who have a huge amount of workers living in Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Kuwait, Qatar, and so on. So this is only one aspect of how you can think about the impact of migration. Now, away from figures, away from graphs, away from the impact of the economy, what else do you think you should take into account if you were to think about the impact of oil, where it is found, and the implications in terms of migration? What else, how else, or where else would you look for the impact of migration inter-regional migration caused by oil on the economies and societies of the Middle East? What other aspects would you be interested in studying?
Conflict.
Sorry? Conflict, wars, we'll talk about it in a minute. Conflict because effectively the oil is not distributed evenly. There's so much oil in certain countries that have very few people, very small populations, resulting in this migration. And one huge aspect of people, of scholarship of migrant workers is about the working conditions and the labor laws that govern these people. The millions of workers working in Saudi Arabia where there are no, of course, trade unions. You're not allowed to be a member of a trade union, let alone to go on strike. You have very, very few protections. The business about the kafil, that is, now they're trying to control it, but you go there, your passport is taken from you, you become a hostage. And there's a whole, again, a huge amount of literature, of scholarly literature about this particular aspect, but about many other aspects of the labor conditions and the labor laws that govern migrant workers.
Where is the scholarship? Who writes about that?
There is a huge amount. For example, if you take the Cairo papers, our own Cairo papers in social sciences produced and published by AUC Press, the ILO, International Labour Office, and its Arab chapter. There's so much that, maybe after class I can give you citations of many of AUC professors in sociology and economics who work closely on this over a matter of 20, 30 years. Ever since I joined AUC, there's an enormous amount of literature produced in English and in Arabic on this subject. So we can talk about this. It's not difficult to find. So conflicts, labor laws.
Maybe relationships with superpowers.
Relationships of superpowers. If we come back to the impact of the interregional migration, religion.
Formation of these governments very centralized.
The formation of these countries, the central. But again, this is not exactly what I'm looking at. But just since you mentioned it, if you remember, just after the outbreak of the Arab Spring revolts, did anyone remember what Oman did? The Sultanate of Oman, Sultan Qaboos.
Not to see. The people go home early. We were just talking about this in the last class. Everyone's calm, everyone's happy.
Yeah. Why? What did the government do?
He goes and pays everyone.
Yeah, he created new jobs. I don't know, hundreds of thousands of new jobs. Again, it's what is called the rentier state, a state that thrives and depends on rent rather than wages, using classical economic terms, rather than and the country does not rely, the central government and its budget does not rely on taxation. Taxation is a small percentage of the income that the government gets. It's rent. It's basically the proceeds of oil exports. Chester, you said something about religion?
Religion, yeah. Well, I guess I've heard the idea of people in the region going to work in the Emirates and it having, or the Gulf, and the kind of bringing back when they, or whatever, the ideas, the religious ideas from the region.
Traditions.
Yes. Traditions, religion.
Remittances?
No, we mentioned remittances, but we're talking about the cultural rather than the economic. So that's another huge aspect. Oil, again, because oil is discovered in or has been discovered in countries like Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and the Emirates, which, I mean, now of course they have a very, especially the Emirates, a very vibrant cultural and artistic scenes with its own deformations in my mind. But let's say 50 years ago, 30 years ago, 20 years ago, these are rather conservative regimes, conservative societies, patriarchal societies. Many of them are still not completely tribal, but have tribal affinities, and tribal affinities matter in politics and society and in culture. So if you are Palestinian or if you're Syrian or Egyptian coming from a place like Damascus or Aleppo or Cairo or Alexandria, working in the Gulf, there is a cultural shift that happens. I have a friend of mine, those of you who you may know Cairo Observer, the blog Cairo Observer is a famous blog on Cairo written by a student of mine from NYU, Muhammad al-Shahid. Muhammad al-Shahid grew up in the Gulf. He said, these are not cities. He's an urbanite. He lives in Alexandria. He says, I would go down, walk and buy the newspaper, a bottle of milk and some cigarettes for my dad. And here I was in Riyadh, or I can't remember which city. You don't do this. There's not this kind of street life. It's a completely different urban setup. The cafe culture, the latest issue of the American Historical Review, the flagship of the American Historical Society, has a picture of a coffee shop, a painting of a coffee shop from Aleppo, I think, or Damascus, I can't remember. It's in coffee shops that ideas are generated. It's in coffee shops where political agitation starts. It's in coffee shops that you can speak about the cultural life. Very different from malls. Malls are very different from coffee shops. So so many people came back, especially in Saudi Arabia, where there is a very strong conservative government with its own interpretation and its own alliance with a particular blend of Islam. And there are millions and millions of Egyptians, especially Egyptians, who have been working in the Gulf and work for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, and who've become very much influenced by the political climate, the cultural climate, the intellectual lifestyle, and the religious ideas of the countries that they worked in. And this had had an enormous impact on the structure of the Egyptian family, political ideas circulating. A lot of what we're seeing in Egypt now, especially of Salafis and of the Ikhwan, is very much influenced by their years of exposure, especially in Saudi Arabia. There's a generation of Ikhwan leaders who made their money and who grew up, especially in Saudi Arabia, in the 70s and 80s. I'm not sure where Khairat Shata made his money, but I wouldn't be surprised if he actually made his money in Saudi Arabia in particular. But there's a lot of, and that, it comes with an enormous amount of ideas and influences of that are very much shaped by Saudi political and cultural life. Because all of this would not have been possible without a reason for these people to go and work in the Gulf in the first place. And that was me.
Are you saying culture and money, culture plus money coming from oil basically made them all culture versus the coffee shop culture that is like with Egypt or something?
I am saying that with the oil money, you have now a different lifestyle. That I am not dismissive of. I take it very seriously. I am very much against those people who say those are tribes. They live in the desert. No, they're not deserts anymore. Might have been deserts 70 years ago, but these are very important centers of political and cultural life, but they are very different from the kind of culture and politics that had been developed, let's say, in a place like Istanbul, or a place like Beirut, or Cairo, or Aleppo, or Damascus, or Jerusalem. You know, the old centers of urban civilization in the Middle East. I'm not, again, dismissive of saying, oh, these are latecomers, what do they know? They know a lot, and they are very clever and very astute, especially in the Emirates, in how to invest in culture. Now, I want to end with something that is the opposite of culture, which is something that has been touched, conflict, which is war. Because also this enormous amount of money has not only been spent in opening a Guggenheim, because Dubai now, the Abu Dhabi, has a branch of the Guggenheim Museum, a branch of the Louvre Museum. There's an entire branch of New York University in Abu Dhabi. Georgetown and Cornell and, you know, some of the leading American universities now have campuses, not only small departments or offices, but entire campuses built in the Gulf. Huge investment in education, something that will sure to impact AUC in the years to come. Did I? No. So again, in addition to investing in culture and building the hospitals and the schools and the highways, and opening the tap and closing the tap and importing labor and closing off the labor market, all of this, there is also the enormous amount of anxiety. If you have so much oil and so much money, but with very few resource mechanisms to defend it with, that is why they invest so heavily in building military arsenals. You need to have strong armies to protect yourself with, in order to protect this wealth with. Again, it's not the absolute figures, sorry, it is the percentages. Look at the amount of, in terms of percentages, the percentage of the Saudi budget that goes into the military compared to other countries in the world, compared to, especially, where is Israel? Israel is not here. Israel is in the following one. Israel, which is a highly militarized country in terms of the percentage of the national budget that goes to the military. Look at Saudi Arabia, nearly twice as much in terms of percentages. I'll end with just two ideas. I'm sorry, I'm running out of time, but I want to end with two ideas about this. One is that despite all this investment in huge amounts of weaponry, aircraft and tanks, when push comes to shove, in times of actual combat, the Gulf War, this huge amount of investment doesn't really count. Remember when Saddam invaded Kuwait? It was the Americans who came and defended the Saudis. In other words, the Americans make their calculation. This is such an important resource. We will not allow, local players to fiddle around with it. And despite the fact that Saudis have an enormous arsenal, we will not really let them run the show alone. We will have to build our own coalition. We will have to come and defend this important source of oil ourselves, and that is what led to the Gulf War.
There are stories of Saddam's army finding like those F-35 fighter jets like in the box,
in Saudi Arabia. Yeah. So again, it's a serious question because it makes you think, where is this money going? They say we are building a national air force, a national army, but when really the test comes, it's not the Saudi army that defends Saudi oil fields. It's the American army that defends Saudi oil fields. I'll end with one small anecdote that has nothing to do with oil immediately. It is a story that a friend of mine told me, unrelated to oil, unrelated to Saudi Arabia. It's a story about their summer house, an Egyptian friend of mine who has a summer house on the coast, on the north coast, west of Agami, west of Alexandria, in a place called Abu Talat. I'm sure you passed through it when you go to Marina. There's a beach called Abu Talat. Now, Abu Talat is a beach, it's a stretch of land on the Mediterranean called Abu Talat. And Abu Talat is named after Sheikh Abu Talat. Sheikh Abu Talat is a Bedouin. Sheikh, some 50 years ago, maybe 40 years ago, made his money through smuggling with Libya, way before oil. People made their money by smuggling commodities across the border. And he made his money through smuggling. And he amassed an enormous amount of wealth. But this wealth he wouldn't give to his sons. He would literally go around with the money wrapped around his waist in a belt, banknotes, because this is how he thought he would preserve it. Okay? Until, and the kids are growing up, and now they're young men, and they no longer want to engage in this risky business of what was back then called Tuggar Shanta. They actually take a suitcase across the border, sell some linen here and get some perfume back and this kind of thing. You say, our father had made this enormous amount of money that he wouldn't give us. The story goes that they actually conspired to kill him. And they killed him in order to, and now some of them are famous businessmen and it's the story. This story is told by one of them, one of these sons who, whether it's a true story, whether they actually killed the father or not. But this is what I'm talking about. This is this anxiety of this enormous amount of wealth and what to do with it. And some regimes are more clever than others in how to invest it and build allegiances. But what I find most intriguing, thank you, is the stories of millions of people we know and we hear about, people who work 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 25 years in Kuwait and never become Kuwaiti citizens. The story of the Bidoons, the millions of Kuwaitis who do not have ID papers, who do not, in other words, benefit, let alone the migrants. And let alone the hierarchy of migrant workers. Of course, the Americans and then the Europeans come first, and then a whole range of migrants at the bottom of which are the South Asians. So it's a highly hierarchized society with very little equity in how this enormous amount of wealth is distributed, with very few prospects of fusing these millions of people who come in and say, yeah, you stay 5 years. If you stay 6 years, you'll become a Kuwaiti national. You'll become a Saudi national. That option was closed from day one. That option was not open for people who spend the best years of their lives building these countries, literally, sometimes with their hands, sometimes with their expertise. And at the end of the day, there's no pension, let alone a nationality, let alone a passport, let alone the prospect of enjoying the fruits of what you've done. So you can make sure, I'm going to post the questions for the final tomorrow, but you can make sure that one of the questions is about oil, and I think I can tell you what it will be. It is to ask you to think about whether the discovery of oil in the region has been a blessing or a curse.